Okay, we are ready to get started. We still have some folks that are joining us. All right. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kalisha Davis, and I am the CS Equity Curriculum Project Director at the Kapor Center. And it's my sincere honor and pleasure to welcome all of you here today for the soft launch and national release of the Culturally Responsive Sustaining Computer Science Education Framework. If you're new to our work, next slide, please. If you're new to our work, Kapor Center is a national organization headquartered in Oakland, California, dedicated to removing barriers in STEM education and tech careers for Black, Latinx, Native American, and other historically marginalized communities. This webinar is the next in our series of conversations that we host as a direct result of the Equitable Computer Science Curriculum Initiative, a national endeavor launched in 2020 designed to cultivate meaningful approaches to creating more culturally responsive, asset-based, and sustainable practices in computer science education. Next slide, please. Today's presentation will cover the following. I'll share a progress report with you about the initiative and what we've accomplished. Our amazing and fearless leader, Dr. Allison Scott, will offer a comprehensive overview of the CRCS framework. Our incredible team, including two of our national advisors, will gather as a full panel facilitated by our colleague, Shana White, to talk all about what is exciting about this opportunity and how we envision this work moving forward. And finally, we will save some time for a Q&A with our audience before we say farewell. While you're listening, if you have any questions for us over the course of this presentation, please feel free to drop them into the chat box and we'll be sure to address as many as we can. Next slide, please. As I share today, I'm going to share a bit of a progress report with you related to the work that we led towards the creation of the culturally responsive and sustaining computer science educational framework, which we aim to serve as a meaningful tool designed for K-12 computer science educators, including teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, and curriculum providers. By now, many of you know that the Equitable Computer Science Curriculum Initiative is a multi-year endeavor designed to create more culturally responsive, sustainable practices in CS education, and that this effort launched in 2020 and now more than a year in the making. Much of the impetus around this work is rooted in Kapor Center's continued commitment to disrupt structural barriers in computer science education that deny students in historically marginalized communities access to the resources and information that they rightfully deserve in every school community and in every classroom. This ranges from a lack of access to qualified and certified teachers, a lack of rigorous STEM courses, inequities in access to computer science classes, and even difficulties with accessing broadband and technology devices. All of these create a void that this initiative aims to address. Despite that fact, we entered into this work at the height, or despite that, we entered into this work into the height of the global pandemic, deep political divide and racial tension, and social unrest, and we've made remarkable progress. This list represents what we started, with our first task being to conduct a national survey of educators to determine the landscape of culturally relevant computer science curriculum and instruction. And much of what is listed here has come to fruition. Next slide, please. This includes identifying and recruiting the incredible minds that formed two national advisories. The first group is our extraordinary collective of adult thought leaders with expertise in such disciplines as racial equity, social justice, community building, education, and computer science education specifically. Their insights, experiences, and recommendations provided the foundation for the project's efforts to achieve collective impact among computer science educators, researchers, policymakers, students, and other advocates in K-12 school communities. Next slide, please. The second advisory is the Equitable Computer Science National Student Leadership Team, a dynamic group of high school students representing 7 states and 9 communities throughout the United States that joined us for a variety of thoughtful discussions exploring computer science and technology, leadership development, classroom culture, as well as the power of youth and adult partnerships and supportive school community environments. These student leaders have proven themselves invaluable in articulating their vision for achieving equity in computer science classrooms for themselves and for their peers. Next slide, please. We've also developed a growing network of like-minded professionals that attend our monthly convenings in the form of our national webinar series, in which you are currently a part of. Next slide, please. And we dove headfirst into the research related to this work, first offering a COVID-focused data brief examining how educators were faring through the global pandemic and the impact it has had on computer science in classrooms. Next slide, please. In April of this year, we were thrilled to release the first of its kind national landscape study and report conducted among nearly 3,700 computer science teachers, thanks to the dedicated work of our colleagues, Dr. Alexis Martin, Dr. Sonia Koshy, and Laura Hinton, alongside Brian Twarwick, one of our national advisors and director of education with the Computer Science Teachers Association. CSTA is a national organization that partnered with us to reach so many educators in the field and position this work more broadly. Thanks to these efforts, we know a lot more about the supports, the resources, and information that teachers need from school communities, administrators, and district leads to be more successful. Next slide, please. We're also very grateful to have access to some of the best minds and leaders in the area of computer science education that lent their critical ideas and expertise to our efforts. Next slide, please. And so today, we're very pleased to announce the first iteration of a comprehensive framework that offers insights to the field that underline the critical need for culturally responsive and sustaining practices within K-12 computer science education, and that lend to an intentional and persistent investment in Black, Latinx, Native American, and other historically marginalized students and communities. This resource is research-driven and was reviewed by over several months by not only the members of both of our national advisories, but a collective of other K-12 computer science educators, a variety of national experts in equity, inclusivity, and culturally responsive teaching, as well as a number of well-respected and recognized leaders in the field. Next slide, please. As we release this publication, our intention is to highlight the framework's 2 key elements: a shared definition of culturally responsive, sustaining computer science pedagogy, and an articulated set of core components for implementing culturally sustaining computer science pedagogy in school communities. Next slide, please. Here to inform the breakdown of those 2 elements of the CRCS framework is our Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Allison Scott. Allison?
Thank you so much, Kalisha, and huge shout out and congrats and appreciation to you for leading this project from its inception. Thank you, Kalisha. And as Kalisha mentioned, this is a really exciting day for us. We thank you for joining us and for your interest in this topic. And we are very excited to present this new framework. And once again, I'd be remiss if I did not thank our advisory boards, as Kalisha mentioned, our project team, and the numerous reviewers and experts who helped us to refine this framework. And also thank you to google.org for funding this important work and also articulating a vision for this work. So for many of us that have been in the space focused on broadening participation, we've long understood the need for moving beyond access. That's been a regular conversation in the field. But we lacked a clear definition and a framework that we felt could help guide teacher professional development, preparation, curriculum, and policy. And so as Kalisha summarized, we've been working on this framework for about a year. It's building upon research and theory from scholars across disciplines. And we wanted to be bold, rigorous, and actionable. And I just wanted to say, we anticipate that this is volume 1. We will learn a lot from you about our implementation pilots and receive feedback from the community, and we look forward to your partnership. So as Kalisha mentioned, in terms of the definition, you will see, when you see the actual framework, you will see in the appendix that there are several key terms listed, from culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining pedagogy, all of which we studied and relied on heavily for this framework. And we felt it was important to clearly state a definition that would help us drive this work forward. So our definition is: culturally responsive, sustaining computer science pedagogy ensures that students' interests, identities, and cultures are embraced and validated. Students develop knowledge of computing content and its utility in the world. Strong CS identities are developed, and students engage in larger socio-political critiques about technology's purpose, potential, and impact. And it was important for us to note in the opening and closing paragraphs that this framework itself is situated in a context of racial, socioeconomic, and gender inequality in computer science education, and it's necessary but not necessarily solely sufficient to achieve equity in CS education, and should be implemented alongside broader solutions to dismantle inequity in education and in other institutions across our society. Next slide, please. So the main portion of the second portion of the framework beyond the definition are the core components. So there are 6 core components, and each component has a set of actions, descriptive actions. So the first core component is racism and white supremacy and its manifestation in computer science is understood and acknowledged, and anti-racist practices are enacted. So some of these actions that we felt were important were: educators explore their identities, their positions of power and privilege. They demonstrate awareness of racism in education, and they explicitly teach and practice anti-racist practices in computer science. And we intentionally wanted to start with that as a very bold and provocative statement. Second core component is inclusive and equitable classroom cultures are co-created to create meaningful learning experiences for students and ensure belonging for students from all backgrounds. So to do this, we describe educators confronting and dispelling stereotypes and biases, honoring and affirming students' identities, and intentionally recruiting students from diverse backgrounds, including students with disabilities, Black, Native American, Latinx students, girls, and non-binary students. The third core component, which will look familiar to a lot of you scholars who have studied culturally relevant pedagogy. The third core component is that pedagogy is rigorous, so aligned to K-12 CS standards, and sets high expectations for all students. It is relevant and authentic to their experiences, interests, and cultures, and it examines the current and historical socio-political context within which CS is situated. So some of these actions would include obviously ensuring that curriculum is high quality, rigorous, challenging, and aligned to state and national standards, that educators are incorporating students' cultures, interests, and passions, and again, that we're critically examining technology and interrogating its role in society and its ethical, political, and societal implications. Next slide, please. Core component 4. And we'll talk a lot more about this, but Kalisha was very prominent in bringing this to the forefront in our conversations. Student voice, student agency, and self-determination are valued, encouraged, and incorporated in the process. So we want educators to incorporate student voice in the curriculum development process throughout the classroom experience and engage them as cultural experts. And in addition, honoring and respecting the ways that students process and learn information, and being mindful and inclusive about their engagement. Number 5. And if Tunde Sobohimine is on the line, we have to give all credit to him for this number 5. Families and communities and their cultures and assets are incorporated into the design of CS curriculum, classrooms, and learning opportunities. So they are sought out as experts and their perspectives are incorporated into computer science. Educators can also partner with community-based organizations to build interest in CS and invite families and communities to engage in learning CS for their own knowledge in addition to what their students are learning. And then number 6, this might seem very obvious, but we felt it was incredibly important to have included as a core component. A diverse variety of experts are incorporated into the classroom to intentionally expose students to a variety of computing professionals and careers. We felt it was really important to talk about the range of technology-related careers. We talk often about how computing is in every field, but to be very explicit about that and provide examples and provide exposure to role models that we know can have a positive impact on students' identity and their aspirations. And then using a variety of different tools to introduce industry professionals and career pathways into classrooms, especially for places that are not necessarily like Oakland, California, that have access to many different tech companies down the street, but places that, you know, we want to, if we're truly being equitable, we want to ensure that all students in all CS classrooms can have exposure to a vast variety of computing professionals. So with that, I know we went through that really quickly, but we are exceptionally excited to share the bit.ly link. If you click on that, that should take you to the full PDF version of the official framework. We encourage you to share it out using the hashtag KaporCRCS. We are, again, incredibly excited and very, very, very grateful for all of the work that's gone into this project. And I'm so excited to engage in a conversation and to also check out the chat and hear your questions and answers.
All right, my turn. Thank you, Dr. Scott. I'm excited to moderate this panel of just key figures that were involved in the development of this framework, to kind of break down parts of the framework that resonate with them and how they feel this will move the needle forward equity-wise nationally for all K-12 CS. So our panelists are listed on the screen. Dr. Yolanda, Dr. Aman, we're both on our National Advisory Board. Dr. Scott's our CEO of Kapor Center. You have Kalisha, who's in charge of the Equitable CS Curriculum Project. And then myself, I'm just a wingman. I'm just here to just hang out and chill. So I'm just here to listen to all the other brilliant people and just hanging out. Can you go to the next slide, please? All right, so the first question, and this is for everybody to answer, and we'll start with Yolanda, then Aman, then Dr. Scott, then Kalisha, and myself. What excites you the most about this CRCS framework? So we'll start with Yolanda.
Well, first of all, hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being with us. You could be anywhere else at this moment in time, and you chose to be with us. And Sean, I want to thank you. You are not just hanging out. Your brilliance is part of this as well. And I'm going to tell you that the entire framework, the idea of the framework in and of itself excites me. And I want to give props to Shauna because we were talking earlier, and I'm looking at some of the chat comments and saying, out the gate, we're being bold, we're being courageous. That is what excites me. It excites me that we are releasing this now in a time where people are a little confused about, should we talk about race? Why are we talking about race? And we're saying, listen, race is what we all live with. We know that it has manifested and continues to manifest in schools in unequal ways, and particularly in certain fields, like computer science, like math. And so I'm excited about the very idea of it, but I am very specifically excited about numbers 5 and 6. In particular, number 5, that Tunde inspired all of us to think about is this bridge. We often talk about the digital divide bridge, right? But it's like reconceptualizing and having families and communities, right, being bridged by computer science. Because finally, families or communities and students are seeing where this can live in their lives, and to be able to articulate that to their families and to their communities, and to have this framework be the beginning, right, of bringing families and communities and schools together that we so desperately need. And number 6, you can't be what you can't see. In the academy, we often talk about, cite a Black woman, cite a person of color. We go through teacher education programs and we read Dewey, we read Vygotsky, we read a lot of sort of white male-centric scholars as though there are no other scholars to contribute. And so for number 6, being very deliberate about highlighting BIPOC scholars and practitioners in the field of computer science is allowing children to see someone that they can possibly be. So I'll stop at that, but as you can see from my body language, I'm absolutely excited, and it's been a privilege to be a part of this.
Dr. Aman?
Yeah, I'll second that. Thank you all for being here, and shows your commitment to justice-oriented computer science education. The word that we've used in our advisory board meetings has been family and love, right? So there's been so much love and effort and commitment that's gone into putting this framework together. And Shayna is totally a badass and a rock star. And I've learned a lot, and she's inspired a lot of what's in the framework. What I'm most excited about the framework, rather than talk about specific practices at a broader level, I think it provides a multi-pronged approach to justice and equity-focused computer science education. So it involves 2 aspects. One is broadening participation in computer science. So we have more Black and brown students who are pursuing computer science. So we have increased representation in computing. So the framework includes actions and strategies for teachers and how they can use culturally responsive pedagogy to center students and communities within computer science classrooms as experts in the classroom. But we can't just stop at representation, right? That's only one part. We also need to address the colorblind racism that exists in computing industry. We need to re-examine the basic assumptions about the design of technology, implementation of those technology, and the role that computer science plays in that, because those technologies are designed and deployed in a way that harm and oppress Black and brown people. So this framework really highlights the role of computer science and brings that criticality to computer science that doesn't exist yet, at least not at the K-12 level in the ways that we want it to exist, and how K-12 educators can address the role of racism in computer science education. So I'm really excited about how this can shape computer science education, not only at the K-12 level, but also undergraduate faculty should be using this to inform their pedagogical practices and how they're centering undergraduate students and needs and the communities within their computer science classroom, and not using computer science to just achieve capitalistic goals for tech companies. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. Dr. Scott?
I think the words of Dr. Aman and Dr. Yolanda really covered much of what I would have said excites me. So I would just like to echo those sentiments. I would just add, I think how long the field has needed this, and not even just computer science education, but in my grad school days, it was, looking at culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy across all fields. And I think it's really exciting to see all of these pieces come together into a framework that can be easily understood. And also, I think it's a really interesting moment. So we started this project before COVID and before everything that's happened over the last year. And since then, we've spent a lot of time in our work at the Kapor Center talking about reimagining computer science education. So I feel like those pieces have collided, and I'm starting to think about this as a framework, or even starting to play a role in a blueprint towards the vision of like, what does computer science education start to look like, and what do the next, or should the next 30 years look like? And we have opportunity to kind of create that future now. So that's what I'm most excited about.
Awesome. Kalisha?
So also seconding everything that our wonderful advisors, Dr. Yolanda and Aman and Dr. Scott just shared. Anyone that knows me knows that I have a heart for young people, especially, and engaging them as experts and leaders is something that's really critically important to me in any setting, not just classrooms, but also after school programs, any place where young people are a part of the community. They should be a part of the conversation for what frames the community. And so that's the easy answer. But I think also the opportunity to drive the work forward through collaboration and collective impact is also really exciting to me. These relationships that will form as a result of the work that people do together is something that can really be powerful. And I said it a little earlier, despite some of the setbacks that we experienced as a part of the global pandemic and pulling this work together, we've seen through the power of relationships that anything is possible. I have not laid eyes in person on Yolanda. I just was able to connect with Aman about 2 weeks ago, but I feel like she's a sister. She's a wonderful colleague. I have so much appreciation for her. I have so much appreciation for you, Shayna. I think that we have been able to center in on all of the amazing things that make computer science unique and special. And I hope that people feel that when they engage in this document.
Awesome. I would just like to add from the teacher's perspective, this document is a breath of fresh air. Pretty much this is how I operated in my classroom. And it was seen as not normal. It was seen as odd. It was seen like, why are you doing all this work? And because I know how our system is set up to make sure that kids that are from marginalized communities not be successful, my job is to make sure to try to dismantle that in any type of way that I can through computer science. And so I think this tool is going to be great for teachers to kind of dismantle a lot of the inequities that exist in our K-12 schools, especially using the avenue of computer science. And I even mentioned this to Dr. Scott before. This framework literally can be plopped into any content area. You can throw social studies into this, you can throw science, you can throw math, you can throw ELA. So I think this framework is very versatile in that fact that these concepts can be applied across all content areas. And you're basically going to be giving kids what they deserve to get in K-12 education, which is an education that's going to be liberating. Next slide, please. Which core practice are you most excited about, and which do you believe has the greatest potential to impact the K-12 computer science education community? I'll start with Dr. Scott, and then I'll go to Aman.
Okay, so I, of course, am excited about all 6. So if I have to narrow it down, I'm going to narrow it down to 3, and I'll tell you why. So number 1, just I think somebody said in the comment out the gate, we wanted to be intentionally bold and make a statement acknowledging the role racism plays in society, in education, and in computer science education. I think that's just a really important place for us to start and to orient ourselves. And then as has previously been stated, as we think about all of the different ways in which we can translate that one core concept into teacher professional development, PD, curriculum, policy, it's just a really important, I think, core concept. And then I'm also really excited about number 3 and the third component in number 3, which is examining current and historical socio-political context within which CS is situated. So that's like, we've heard a lot of conversations about ethics, about the impacts of technology. And I think the orientation, this orientation, I think, will challenge the notion that CS is neutral, apolitical, or objective. And I think it's a really engaging opportunity for students to engage in the conversations about what computing is versus just learning how to code.
Awesome. Aman?
I'll pick one practice. I'm most, in addition to, it's hard to pick a practice, right? I talked about the need to bring criticality in computer science education, which is incredibly important. I'm most excited by practice 4 that centers families and communities and their cultural assets into the design of computer science curriculum and the learning experiences that students have. I think by using community assets in the design of the curriculum and those learning opportunities, we can broaden participation into computing, but also use CS as a tool for personal agency and creative expression, right? Typically, computer science is often driven by capitalistic goals, right? Where we train students to learn to program so they can go and get jobs and go work for those tech companies. But rarely do we center students' lived experiences and communities in the curriculum and in the classroom, right? So the framework challenges this notion that we need to parachute CS curriculum into classrooms, right? I'm borrowing that term from Sasha Costanza-Chalk, who has worked on design justice and uses that parachuting and technology to solve problems in a community. So I'm applying that to parachuting in CS curriculums. Rather, it asks, how can we use those students in school and out of school experiences and perspectives within the CS content and instruction. And I think those concrete actions that teachers can take to connect with communities is what I'm most excited about. I think we need to ensure that the teachers are supported to go beyond the walls of the classroom and be in those community spaces and bring cultural experts into their classrooms. So some of the things that we've been thinking, me and my colleague Michael Latchney, on how we can do that in classrooms. So I'm most excited about that.
And I would just add, for me, number 2 is probably the most exciting because that was one of the ones that we grappled with immensely in the beginning, because if we're talking about equity, then we have to include everybody. It's not just racial equity, it's students with disabilities getting their needs met, it's ELL students. And so I think understanding that equity is a really big onion, but ultimately, like Fannie Lou Hamer says, nobody's free until everybody's free. And so understanding that, bringing the asset-based opinion of my students into the classroom, incorporating their culture, what they believe, making my stuff accessible is key to being successful in computer science. So I think number 2 is really exciting for me because it gives teachers practical advice on how to make sure their class is inclusive of all learners, not just the ones that want to take the class, not just the white ones, not just the boys, but it's inclusive of every single body that comes in that class. Next slide, please. All right, the next question is, how does this framework differ from the ways that computer science has been previously taught? And so I'll start with Aman for that one, and then I'll go to Kalisha and Allison. Unmute yourself.
Now you think after 16 months, I would have learned that. To use that analogy of parachuting CS curriculum, again, I think that's how we typically teach computer science, right? It's a very much a top-down approach that's tied to standards, that's tied to frameworks, and nothing wrong in that, but those standards and frameworks are not culturally responsive, right? Or culturally responsive is not the center of those standards and frameworks, right? They're primarily driven by what students need to learn and to get jobs, right? Which is important, right? But we also need to start thinking about how do we teach computer science in ways that it's used as a tool for liberation and wealth generation in communities, and not to just meet capitalistic goals of companies. So I think the way this framework centers the needs of the community and brings that criticality in K-12 classrooms, challenges the notions of how technology is designed and implemented. I think that's how this framework is different.
Kalisha?
Sure. So this framework we know was created intentionally to fill a void that exists in computer science classrooms across the country. And that is the ability to really disrupt structural inequities. My colleagues have already stated it very eloquently, that we are intentionally calling it out for a very specific purpose, because we want to be able to serve students of historically marginalized communities that really deserve the opportunity to be successful. And so we're inviting teachers to reflect on their biases, determine where they honestly need the most help in being the best version of themselves for their students in the communities that they serve. And we know that this particular work, it feels different, and it is different. And we know that we really want to encourage school communities to center their focus on supporting teachers who have carried the lion's share of the work on their shoulders for entirely too long, and engaging and partnering with students who ultimately are really the most important stakeholders in this type of endeavor. So, so everyone plays a role, and it's all hugely important.
Dr. Scott?
Thanks. The only thing I would add is I think one of the ways that it differs is that previously it feels like there was a focus on the content first, like let's learn these concepts, let's learn these standards, then let's think about how to teach them, and then let's think about how to broaden participation within that framework. And so I think we're kind of flipping that on the head and saying, you know, what we know about how to truly engage, include, and inspire all students in CS classrooms is to start in the reverse order. So I think that's one of the like kind of fundamental ways that this differs. And I'm not going to quote this exactly, but one of the teachers from one of our pilot PDs was talking, which is focused on racial equity in computer science, was focused on this very concept that her orientation was always like the content has to come first and then I will figure out how to like engage all of my students. And so I think that is just a really exciting new way to think about how we teach computer science education to all students.
Absolutely. And I can tell you from experience, when you build community in your classroom, teaching the content is so easy. And so laying the foundation in the beginning with your students, respecting their identities that they're bringing to the classroom, you sharing the identities you bring into the classroom, dispelling any type of biases or myths that you have in the beginning, and building this kind of tight-knit community. And the computer science classroom is huge, especially when I worked on the middle school level, for kids having self-efficacy and confidence in completing computer science tasks, because they knew, hey, this is a very brave space for me to learn in. Like, I'm not going to get made fun of. I'm accepted as for who I am. And it's okay to ask questions, and it's okay to not know. And I'm going to use the wealth of knowledge around me to better myself as a computer scientist. So I can completely 100% co-sign, Dr. Scott, what you said, seeing it work in my classroom, that we didn't even get started with any concept in computer science until like the first 2 or 3 weeks of class, because I wanted to make sure that the room was a brave space for all the students so that they can move around in computer science bravely. Next slide. All right, the next question is, how might this change how students experience computing education, and what kind of outcomes do you hope to see? And I'll start with Yolanda, because I'd love for you to bring in your perspectives with what you do with your work. And I know you work very closely with Dr. Goldie Muhammad and Dr. Bettina Love, who also influenced this framework. So how do you think that this will just change the student's experience in the classroom as it relates to CS?
Thank you for that question. You know, I'm sitting here and having the wonderful opportunity to reflect and listen, and really seeing what this whole initiative has done, from the student advisory board to our advisory board, even in this very moment of who's on this panel. What it does is shift for students, when they tap into it, who can talk about this? Who has the expertise? Who's represented, right? So that, you know, just out the gate, I feel that this initiative is shifting, you know, just the visuals, right, in terms of all of that. So how might it change students? And again, I'll tie back to number 6. And when Dr. Aman says, yes, it has to be more than representation, he's absolutely right. However, starting with the representation of allowing them to see scholars themselves, even us, other students, talking about computer science, it's a portal of sorts, right? It sort of opens up this possibility of them being able to see themselves as computer scientists, or if they choose not to go in that direction, to know that it still is a possibility. They may shift and say, well, I want to do English, I want to do music, but just knowing that the computer science is a possibility. And so that's what I hope to see, and the way that we have designed this and written this, where self-work is embedded, this idea of archaeology of self, that both teachers and students will take a moment to pause to imagine themselves as computer scientists, if you will, or the possibility of kind of moving in that world, and to open up the opportunity for people to do some deep work around issues of race, class, gender, and have the conversations that we know we all live with and live under. And, you know, it's an opportunity for truth telling, because I think that sometimes we're just living with a bunch of lies about who we are as a nation, how we don't discriminate within education and specifically within certain fields. This framework opens up to say, yes, we name it, And therefore, because we name it, we're opening possibilities on how to change it and how to navigate it and work with it. So that's what I hope to see. I hope to see some more honesty, some truth telling in classrooms, and the building of relationships with teachers and students as they explore the power of computer science.
That was perfectly stated. Dr. Aman, would you like to add to that, please?
Yeah, just to, I totally agree with everything that Dr. Yolanda said. You know, the way that it value students' perspectives in the classroom, right? What they bring to the classroom is seen as assets and not as deficits, right? And I think that's important for students to develop identities in computer science, right? So that their identity is valued in the classroom and their perspectives are actively sought out, you know, and what happens in computer science classrooms. And I think that, as you were saying, Shana, that building that community, starting with that first, and the content will take care of itself, right? So I think that's what this adds, and it'll change the student experience.
And Dr. Scott?
Sure, I would just add, I think often in the space, and of course, as a researcher, we, and I'll say myself included, often think about the outcomes. So we say like, how will this translate into student outcomes? So we're looking at like course participation, grades, test performance. And I think it will, if done correctly, impact all of those things. But I think what's more exciting to see is related to what Yolanda and Aman shared about developing identities, exposure to different ways of thinking about what computer science is and the opportunities that it presents to all students, and the opportunities that aren't in one specific track. Like, I know that there are these big tech companies and I can go work there, but thinking about in much more innovative ways about solving problems and about solutions that our communities need, and having it be grounded in very local contexts, as I've heard Aman talk very eloquently about. So I think that's I think that would both change student experiences, and I think that we will see those outcomes. And I do think that those outcomes are critical to leading to the things that we then go on to measure.
Absolutely. And to kind of play off your statement, I think the other thing that this framework will necessarily do for students is to actually humanize computer science, which is so desperately needed. People think that tech is just tools. And we have to remember that people are running those tools and making them do the things that they do. And so humanizing a subject that most people don't feel is very human, because we have so many advanced in tech, I think is another huge importance, that the human side of computer science is rectified and dealt with, because I think that a lot of people are still replicating harm in tech spaces because that human side of saying, if I develop this tool, who is it going to harm? That was never considered when I was developing this tool. But if I go in and I say, this is my identity, but how will my tool harm this identity or that identity, is huge to making tech more human, and understanding the power that when we humanize things, everybody gets included. It's the minute we start to dehumanize, we exclude people. But when we start to humanize things, everybody gets a seat at the table, everybody gets included, everybody's voice is heard and respected and valued. And I think understanding that this will humanize computer science for students, I think is very, very huge. And especially in K-12 education, being a long-term educator, I know how dehumanizing the education system is. And so for kids to be able to have a space where they're humanized, I think would be a huge leap forward in addressing a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in K-12 education. Can you go to the next slide, please? How will this framework help educators and other members of the K-12 computer science community? And we'll start with Aman, we'll go to Kalisha, then I think we're going to do Yolanda and Allison too.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about the framework, it provides concrete strategies and actions for K-12 educators to take, right? To call out racism in computer science education, to center students' lives and communities in computer science classroom, right? And those actions would provide teachers with strategies, skills, and how they can challenge white supremacy in computer science education. We need to call out white supremacy and the role it plays in computer science education and bringing that anti-racist pedagogy. But I'm hoping that we just don't stop and then put the burden on just teachers to be able to take those concrete actions and steps. We need to make sure that there are systems in place from the curriculum, that when we're designing curriculum, we're thinking about this framework. We're keeping this curriculum or this framework at the center of what kinds of experiences we're designing for computer science. We also need to provide structures and room in the curriculum for teachers to explore these issues, right? We can't have 2-week PD and go and teach the course, right? I think then we're failing, right? This framework is not meeting its goal and the intended outcomes that we've been talking about. So that's my hope, that we both support teachers and not just leave for teachers to be implementing the strategies and actions that are in the framework.
Kalisha?
Well, Aman, of course, shared a number of really important points around this question, and I totally agree. I'd love for teachers to feel seen and understood as a result of engaging in this work. I'd love for educators to know that we understand the significant load that they're carrying on their shoulders as people who are informing, leading, and inspiring future generations. I hope that the framework combined with our modules and professional development opportunities that we're going to talk about, those ongoing conversations to form learning communities. I hope that will help and allow educators of all types to have actionable strategies that are dynamic and meaningful to both them and their students.
Dr. Scott?
A few key points. Going back to the teacher survey, we heard from teachers in that survey of 3,700 CS educators that there were a couple key things that I think this framework addresses. So one is confusion in mindset around, like, am I supposed to be teaching am I supposed to be talking about issues of race, gender, socioeconomic status, politics, culture in a CS classroom? That was like a controversial a controversial perspective. So I think if this framework can help orient folks around why that's important, I think that'll be helpful. And then also, I think there were about 40% of teachers who said that they just didn't feel that they had enough curriculum or instructional practices, or just needed more support in understanding how to actually implement culturally responsive practices in computer science education and how to design curriculum. So I think on a technical level, and then we'll talk more about our implementation, but on a technical level, I think those are directly meeting the needs of what the CS teacher community has been asking for.
One of the
go ahead.
One of the thoughts that came to my mind as I was listening to Kalisha and Allison is, I think this framework, not only for in-service teachers, but also thinking about as we're preparing the next generation of teachers through teacher education programs and pre-service teachers that are in those programs. I think this framework would be incredibly useful for informing the kinds of courses and kinds of pedagogical approaches we're using in teacher education programs, not only in computer science, but let's across all disciplines.
Dr. Mann, I was actually thinking how this is actually writing educational history. And I think a lot about, so this idea of critical race theory, which started in legal studies, and along came like Doctors Gloria Ladson Billings and William Tate, and brought that into education. In some ways, I feel this is what is happening with this framework. And I think also about the culturally relevant sustaining framework created by New York State, right, through the Metro Center, that it's broad. It's so broad that it's impacting teachers across the country. They're taking the framework and applying it to their teaching. So Shana, when you mentioned Dr. Gholdy Muhammad earlier, the reason I think her book, Cultivating Genius, is really so hard-hitting is because of the framework is so inviting for teachers to see themselves, all teachers, whether they're teaching algebra or whether they're teaching, I don't know, the periodic table in chemistry. So I'm sitting here and I'm feeling the weight of this moment, that this framework really is offering, although it's through the lens of computer science, it's really offering something to the entire education field. So when Dr. Mann, we live in the teacher education field, but it certainly is applicable to all areas. So I think that this is like a historical moment that I think we'll reflect back on this and say, okay, that was the day that this happened. It's exciting. And it's June Jordan said, we are the ones we've been waiting for. This is it. We've done it. Now let's just go and implement it and make it live and last.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that I was just here on the side, engaging with all you brilliant people the day that it happened. I can tell my kids about that. I think the other thing, just to really emphasize everything that was said, is understanding that this is such a broad guideline for teachers to help them, but as Aman said and everybody else, that this is not fully the teacher's load to carry. Like, administrators need to understand that this is important. Teachers of ed need to understand this is important. Curriculum providers, all of those people need to be on the same page. And I think that this framework helps put everybody, at least in the computer science community, on that exact same page, and we can build from there. Next slide,
Can I
please.
add one other thing?
Oh,
to
yes,
that?
go ahead.
I just wanted to add one other thing to that, going back to our definition, because we spent a lot of time talking about this, that it is really important in the definition, and back to what you're saying, that it's not just on the teachers, is that we're understanding that the systems have been built on inequality, and that this framework, we have to go beyond the framework. We have to think about equity-oriented policy. We have to think about things like the digital divide, and all of those things together will produce equity. But the full burden cannot just be on the teachers. Thank you.
Absolutely. Next slide, please. Okay. How can this framework be effectively implemented? And I think I'm going to have everybody chime in on this, and we'll start Kalisha, Dr. Scott, Yolanda, and Aman.
Well, I think the answer relates directly to what you just said, Shana, in that last question, that everyone needs to be on the same page, taking the same types of action that are in alignment with one another. This work requires collective and full community involvement and supports. It requires dedicated leadership and teachers that have access to training and supportive environments that allow them to feel confident in what they're teaching, and that they can grow as professionals to lead and guide others through the process. It requires an openness and a willingness to really bring this to fruition. And I think that's the beginning of how you can begin to make this effective.
Dr. Scott?
We've spent a lot of time talking about this. There are many different ways to implement, and we actually evolved our thinking from the outset of thinking just in terms of curriculum. And I would just echo something that Aman said earlier, that I don't think we can think about implementation projects as short term. I think we have to think about how these can be embedded into larger systems. So whether it's teacher education programs, whether it's curriculum development processes. I saw Emily in the chat. Thank you, Emily, thinking about teaching standards. How do they get incorporated into and more institutionalized versus just being kind of one-off if you choose to go through a professional development opportunity that you can. So I think that will be key, and I think we will continue to evolve our thinking, and definitely are excited to launch some of our pilots and get some feedback from the community as well.
Dr. Yolanda?
Yes, yes. I'm thinking of my dear friend, Dr. Lalita Vasudevan, who talks about this concept of patient urgency, that we are urgent in having it out immediately, but also understanding we have to exercise patience, because we need to look at the structures that we're all operating in. And there will be, some obstacles. In some places, there'll be some openings, right? So just having a fuller view of knowing what we need to penetrate. And in some ways, where will the framework lead? And in some ways, where will the framework sort of lift up or open up possibilities? I know I'm speaking very abstractly, but I think that we have to really understand what this framework is doing, the source of interruption that it is offering. And that is going to allow a patient urgency of really understanding the landscape of what is going to change. And if there are places to get in right away, like a particular school district or shifting standards, I mean, let's get in where we can right away, but know that this is for the long haul, because of it's going to touch so much. And in some ways, it's seeking to dismantle some of the things that exist in the system. So I think having a patient urgent view of really what this framework is, it is not just another framework. This is looking to shift the way we see education and the way teachers and students see themselves. So it's like identity work, at the same time doing work unearthing curriculums and structures that need changing.
Absolutely. And Dr. Rahman?
You know, we have standards for everything. You know, we have standards for content mostly. So a crazy idea, why don't we just take this framework and have standards for equity and anti-racist and justice-oriented computer science, right? And that's what we're trying to achieve. So then all the curriculum that's being developed, all the PD and how teachers are supported are then tied to those standards, right? So rather than content-focused standards, these are the standards that we care about in computer science education. So I think that's one way we can you know, do this at scale, like across the country.
Absolutely. Next slide, please. I think this is our last question. Yes. All right, everybody's going to answer this one. We'll go Kalisha, Dr. Scott, Dr. Yolanda, Dr. Aman. How do you envision this framework impacting the future of K-12 computer science education?
Well, that is a big question. And so I'll keep it as simple as I can. I'd love to see computer science courses becoming a core part of the K-12 learning experience across the board. And I think this framework helps open the door for that to happen in more schools across the country. This particular work can really drive new opportunities in workforce development, offer creativity in utilizing technology and leveraging technology for use in schools and throughout the community. And I hope that this framework opens the door to all of those possibilities and invites everyone to be a part of the conversation, you know, because as you all can see, the core components, you know, we're not just talking about students, we're not just talking about teachers, we're talking about families, we're talking about members of the community. We really want to be able to wrap our arms around our youth and one another to make this something that is sustainable for years to come.
Dr. Scott?
Just echoing what Kalisha said, thinking about what the next 30 years look like in education broadly or in CS education, I think how can we collectively chart a path forward? And I think something that was put in the chat, I think it was Chuck saying, you know, as we know, technology is in everything, computing is in everything. So if we think about towards a future of equity and justice, I think that is how I envision this framework impacting not just CS, but since CS and technology is embedded in every single institution and every aspect of our lives and of society, towards just equity and justice overall. So that's my dream.
Dr. Yolanda?
Yes, I'm just going to circle back to how I started with number 6 and representation. My hope, my goal, my dream, my desire is that we will see the numbers shift in terms of who's in the field, who are the technicians, who are the designers, who are the app creators. So just representation in terms of outcomes, and we can all look at those numbers and see the low representation of women and people of color. So I'm hoping that that will shift. And just overall, more BIPOC kids just seeing themselves as computer scientists or mathematicians or anything related to computer science, and that it no longer is, you know, a particular stereotype, right, of who fits the bill of studying that or being interested in it or excited by it. So that's what I want. I'll circle, it's always going to be representation, but meaningful representation that shifts the numbers ultimately. That's my desire, my hope.
Awesome. Dr. Aman?
I envision that K-12 computer science education as a result of this framework is anti-racist, justice-oriented, and community-centered. And computer science is used and in the design of technology is used not as a tool for oppression of Black and brown people, but as a tool for liberation. So that's what I envision the impact of this framework.
Perfect. So eloquently put. All right, so can you do the next slide? We're going to talk about some of the implementation things that we are going to be engaging in with this framework. So the framework is not just like we've done it and we're just going to move on. We understand for true implementation and the ability for this to be long lasting and super powerful across the country, that there has to be other aspects of the framework and our work to basically help this be embedded in our practices in K-12 schools across the country. So the first thing that we're going to offer is a webinar series the rest of the year. So we'll be monthly for the rest of the year. And we're actually going to take a deep dive into each of the 6 core practices of our framework. So our first one will be in July, and we will have a person from the classroom and somebody from the research community coming in and giving their takes, but also open it up for teachers, practitioners, anybody that wants to understand the core practices in more detail. We're going to give them time to talk to people that understand the core practices, implement the core practices, and understand what it should look like in a K-12 classroom. So starting in July, we'll have our first webinar covering Core Practice 1. Core Practice 1 is our biggest meaty one. That's the one about dismantling white supremacy and dealing with racist structures. You'll see advertisements for it on Kapor's social media in the coming weeks. But just to let you know, we are going to have a webinar series to help reinforce the 6 components of our framework. The other thing we're going to have is some implementation pilots. We actually are going to start Kapor Center professional development and instructional coaching this fall. And that I'm excited for because that's where I've been doing a lot of my work since joining the center, as far as developing professional development that I know teachers, it will resonate with them, but it's practical and it makes sense because I just left the classroom. So I understand the burden and this and all the things that have been asked of you. And so to basically understand how can you implement this framework and just adjust what you've been doing so we can disrupt the status quo. We're also going to have some rubrics and scorecards coming out so people can assess how well they are implementing these framework core practices. So we're talking about having a rubric or scorecard for districts to assess how well are we doing with this framework K through 12. Like, are we not meeting the needs that we are in maybe K-5 level, high school level, et cetera. Same thing with rubrics. Administrators can assess teachers and use that for teacher development as far as like, hey, these are some parts of the framework that you're maybe missing in your instruction. Let's work on that together. So rubrics and scorecards will be coming out soon. We're going to have some district partnerships. The states we'll be working with to start right now are going to be California, Georgia, Michigan, and New Mexico. I think I have all the states right. We will be broadening that as we go, but because we are, as I tell people all the time, I was like, Kapor is not as big as I thought it was. There's not a lot of us. We're not a huge staff. So we're starting small, and then we're hopefully going to be able to scale it to reach everybody. And then the last thing, as I think Aman mentioned and Allison, with the curriculum development, like, we feel like the framework had to come first before we talk about developing curriculum. So we need to have a kind of a guideline or a guidepost for the direction we want curriculum to go before we start developing curriculum, because as everybody's echoed on this call, it's not the content in CS that matters. It's really pretty much how the pedagogy in the class and your instructional practices go. The CS content will be mastered by kids if those two things are on board. And so we wanted to make sure we took care of the pedagogy and the instructional practices side first. And then we're eventually going to get to the part where there's some curriculum development. I have a couple ideas to tie some curriculum to Dr. Ruha Benjamin's book, Dr. Sophia Noble's book of Algorithm of Oppression. I've actually talked to Dr. Timnit Jabru, also seeing how I could get her as just a resource to develop curriculum related around AI, artificial intelligence. So there's a lot of things that are becoming in the works, but that'll be down the road. But we wanted to make sure that we had the framework first, and then we were going to build a curriculum that makes sure it meets the framework standards. Next slide, please.
Can I add just
yes,
one
sorry.
quick thing? I've been keeping up with the chat and just wanted to shout out, I'm really appreciative of all of the friends and family in the chat who are also adding new opportunities for us. So I think there are many different opportunities for us to think about the scaling and implementation. As Shana mentioned, we're a small but mighty team, but we have amazing partners. And so folks from CS for All, ESEP, Code.org, NCWIT, Emily with the standards, BT with CSTA. So there's lots of opportunities, I think, for us to scale this work. So please reach out to us if you haven't already about your ideas for how we can implement the framework in multiple different ways. Thank you.
Thank you for clearing that up for everybody. As I said, I'm just here. Applications for that PD cohort. We're actually going to launch a 2 cohort PD of 12 to 15 educators that will actually meet virtually and asynchronously with me on a monthly basis for the entire year. The course map for the course, we get down to the bare bones of each of those core practices, but we talk about it in a larger scale. So the very first thing that we talk about in the first session is what is the origin of racism and race? Because if we don't know where it started, we can't find out ways to dismantle how it's harming people. We're going to talk about culture responsive pedagogy. We're going to talk about intersectionality and critical race theory and how it applies to education. We're going to talk about universal design and inclusive teaching. And then we're also going to finish the entire cohort with teachers being empowered to create their own lessons. So after you get the background information of making sure that my lesson is accessible, that I have all voices represented, that I've made sure that I've listened to the identities of my students and implemented them into my lesson, now I can take this CS concept of maybe algorithms or recursion or whatever, and I can make a lesson that meets the framework standards. So we're going to build the knowledge in the fall and lead up to the spring where teachers feel empowered to actually create their own lessons and their own curriculum, or maybe revise curriculum that they have that maybe doesn't meet parts of the framework. So the applications are open now, and they are due before July 19th. The application should take you about I take that back. It should take you about 10 to 15 minutes because we do ask for some demographic data about your school because we do want to make sure that the people in the cohort are representative of communities that we want to make sure that we're stressing to the front of the line to serve. So feel free to share that link. It's also on our ECS website, but feel free to share that link for any teacher you think that might be interested in joining our inaugural PD this fall. Next slide, please. Oh, perfect. Yay. Q&A. All right. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. I didn't see any questions like while everybody else was talking. But if you have a question and you want to put it in the chat, this is your time to ask all these brilliant people on the call with me. Ask them some questions that you might have about the framework or implementation or anything along those lines. All right, I'm going to start with the first anonymous question. We get a lot of negative feedback from teachers and facilitators that some CSPD spends too much time on equity. What recommendations do our panelists have for how we approach and add more pieces to this framework, to that work? So everybody's scared of equity now, of course, just like we're scared of racism, but it is what it is. So what would you say as far as feedback that people give that's kind of, I don't want to say negative, but I would just say that they're on the wrong side of the fence right now to continue to move this work forward? What's some suggestions that our panelists have? Aman, do you have any?
We need those teachers in the profession. I'm sorry. I'm struggling to think who those teachers, like, yeah, I don't have a response because I wouldn't know how. I don't know how to like we don't need teachers who are afraid of addressing equity or don't see racism as a problem. Yeah, I don't have a strategy for, dealing with that. I don't know if somebody else has a strategy.
Aman, I can add to that. Just from the survey, I think there were what I called confusion. I will generously call confusion. And I will say perhaps that some teachers approach this work with best intentions around, yes, I care about equity. Yes, I want my classrooms to be inclusive. Yes, I believe, girls and students of color have the ability to succeed. But again, going back to what I stated before, but let's focus on the content. We have to get the content done first, and then equity will come second. So I would say maybe as a place to start talking about the orientation of the framework, like you will get to that goal that you have by not necessarily starting with the content. So that's just a thought. But I would second your perspective that I know you were closer with.
So I can never play poker because my face is shocked. So I'm now that I'm over my initial shock. I think it's important for teachers to explore their own identities, right? So I think that's the starting point. That's some of the work that we've done last summer with my colleague Michael and our grad student Sukanya, when we were working with high school teachers who were teaching CS principles. So the first PD session was around exploring their own identity and the role of whiteness in their classroom and in computer science education. So I think that's a strategy that we used. And of course, we had a couple of teachers who didn't see the role of whiteness and their privilege, so they dropped out of the PD, which was okay with me. I think that's one way to try and address that and tackle that, to make them aware of their own identity and privilege.
Absolutely. And the other thing I always tell people is you can't be kind out of an oppressive system. The system was not built for everybody. And so we can't hug it out through it. And so the whole be kind movement that you hear in education, oh, well, just be kind. No, that's not going to get it, because that's where we are right now. That helps maintain the status quo. So understanding that we can't use kindness to get out of oppressive systems. The oppressive systems exist. We have to come to that rationale and reality that they do exist. And then once we come to that, how are we going to maneuver ourselves to dismantle those systems so that it benefits all people involved in the education system? All right, the next question I can answer real quick. Somebody asked, how much does it cost to attend the PD activity? Actually, for the cohorts that we're starting in the fall, we actually are going to pay you. So we will actually reward a stipend to the teachers that get selected to participate in the inaugural cohort this fall. We haven't decided what that stipend will be, but you will get a stipend for participating in the cohort for the entire year. All right, the next question that's from the chat is, what roles do HBCUs and teachers of color play with this framework release? Anybody?
Well, I'm not from an HBCU, but oftentimes doing work with teachers and the ideas of affinity groups and affinity thinking, I think they play a crucial role, and particularly those of them who are in the field of computer science, who study it, to step up and be seen, right? It goes back to what Kalisha was saying. She wants people to be seen. And HBCUs just historically have always been the groundswell for engineers, for doctors. Like most of the Black doctors that exist and Black engineers come from HBCUs. So HBCUs have an incredible history, first and foremost, of just existing at a time when Black people were not seen as human, and then to turn out incredible lawyers and doctors and engineers. So I think HBCUs can be a forerunner, as they have been historically, in this movement that's happening at the K through 12 level, and perhaps inspiring those K through 12 students who will go on to HBCUs, right? And kind of carry this ethos with them from what they learn in K through 12. So there's always a role for HBCUs, because HBCUs have always led the way, particularly in fields like medicine and lawyering and justice and so forth, in terms of putting out citizens who are in those fields? That's a beautiful question.
And maybe
Anybody
That's
else?
a great.
Oh, sorry. Amon, go ahead.
I do worry that we continue to put the burden on teachers of color to do anti-racist work. So I worry about, constantly asking teachers of color in our schools, which they only make about 15–20% off the teaching, or maybe less than that. I don't quote me on that. But I worry the exhaustion that teachers of color face in the classroom when they're constantly being asked to do this work. I think we need to elevate teachers of color in leadership positions as school leaders. And yeah, so that's just some thought. I worry about that.
Allison, did you?
Oh, I was just going to add, related to Amon's point about the diversity of the computer science teaching pipeline. And we know that some of that data from the teacher survey, but I think there's an opportunity to just think more broadly and holistically about how to develop a more diverse crop overall of computer science teachers. And I think then HBCUs absolutely have a role to play in that.
Absolutely. The next question is, how do we get information on the webinars for our teachers and our team?
You're muted, Shayna. You're muted.
You're muted, Shayna.
Yay, I'm muted. See, I told you I shouldn't be on this panel.
No, we want you. We need you.
In the chat, I just put the link to the Equitable CS website, which has not only houses our framework, but also gives you more information about board members, the student board, but also this will be where you will find information about the webinars. Also, all of our social media channels for Kapor Center, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and even Instagram will also have the sign up information there. And then we also have a Splash That page. I'm hoping maybe Kalisha can drop that link in the chat. That also updates every time we have a new webinar coming out. Right now, it's going to have the webinar that we just did previously, which is the one that we're on right now. But eventually in the next week or so, you'll see the update for the webinar that are for the core practices. So that'll be changed in a couple of weeks. So those two websites will be the places that you should go to get additional information about signing up for the upcoming webinars. And I saw one other question and now it is gone. Oh, okay. How will this framework be communicated across the community? Allison, I'll start with you.
Okay, so tangibly, next step. So next week, this is our soft launch, and we so appreciate all of you for joining us and your feedback. So we're going to do a larger communications push next week. So if any of you all would like to support us, would love to have you support us push it out more broadly. And then I think we're taking multiple more steps as we've been talking about implementation projects. So we're trying to get people to understand that there is a framework and then move towards action. So there's a PD coming, and would love to continue to have conversations with organizations, institutions, initiatives to figure out how we can scale and get the framework in the hands of the people that can use it. So first up is communication strategy next week.
And then the next question kind of is the same as that, but a little bit different. This person would like to know about how is this framework going to be partnering, or how are we going to be partnering with curriculum development and utilizing this framework, like what ideas you have. And I guess that's an Allison question again too.
So I think there have been a couple different ideas that we've discussed. And again, back to something that Emily put in the chat around how do we get these different core concepts and practices in front of curriculum developers. And I know there's some organizations that have been working, but if we can get them incorporated into standards, I think that's one opportunity. Two is any of the organizations that develop curriculum, working with them to think about how this framework intersects with their curriculum development process and their teams. And I know we've had really positive outreach while we were developing the framework by a lot of organizations that were asking for this feedback. So now we feel like we have information to give them that can help guide the development of future curriculum. And I'd be remiss if I did not say that in one of our first advisory board meetings, I think it was Tunde who mentioned the opportunity for co-creation and local co-creation of curriculum. And that's something that is really important, I think, to us as we think about things are going to resonate differently in different communities. And so we do have some funding, and that's the third stage of this project, to fund curriculum development projects. And we're still defining what that process looks like, but I think we're being very intentional about wanting it to be kind of local co-curriculum development.
All right. The other question is, I guess it's Sung Kim. Our contact information will be on like the last slide. So I think just reaching out to any of us on the team, and we could hopefully like partner with you in some form or fashion to answer your question. I think those are all the questions that I've seen in the chat, unless anybody has any last minute ones to add. But I think I caught all of them. Emily is sharing another meetup on July 22nd, an Eventbrite. So for those people who are interested in attending that event, I think it aligns with what we're doing with the framework. Feel free to join. We can go to the next slide then. So glad we're on time. All right, acknowledgements. This is the part where this work was not done in isolation. It was a community of people that got this taken care of. And it's a great community of people. I'm blessed to be in that community. But we want to thank and express sincere gratitude to all the people that helped us with this framework. We had teachers, we had administrators, we had people from the higher ed realm, we had researchers, we had national spokespeople on equity. We had just so many people involved in this process to make sure that we didn't miss anything, that we connected all the dots, and we crossed all of our T's and dotted all our I's. So we just wanted to thank all of those people, especially. We also want to thank Google, who is funding the initiative, and their work with us with this project. And we just appreciate everyone's time and commitment to this project that we were doing in the middle of a global pandemic. And the fact that we produce such a brilliant framework amidst all that, to me, is a testament to the team that we had involved. So thank you to everyone that was involved with our development of this framework. Next slide. And then to connect with us, you can actually go to the Kapor website and get our email addresses, but they're also here. This is the 4-person team at the Kapor Center that has been doing a lot of the heavy lifting with the framework. I will say, because she's on the call, don't email Allison. Rather, you email me, Kalisha, or Dinah, because her inbox is like out of control and her calendar is out of control. So if you have to pick people on this slide to contact me, Kalisha, or Dinah first, just because Allison has a whole bunch of other stuff that she's doing too. So, but feel free to contact us, connect with us on social media. Allison is going to start doing a really good job of being on social media this year, because she's going to have a person named Shayna pushing her to do so. But Kalisha and Dinah already do a really good job on social media, and you can follow me on Twitter if I don't get banned again, like I have been this year. But feel free to contact us to ask any questions, connect with us, etc. And I think the next slide is just the thank you, and we're at the end. Next slide. Yay. Oh, I finished 3 minutes early. What a blessing. So thank you so much for attending our launch, our soft launch today. We're grateful for your commitment to making a change in the K-12 computer science community in your pockets of influence. And we hope this framework helps you make that impact greatly in your pocket of influence more so. So thank you to our panelists, Kalisha, Yolanda, Allison, Aman. Thank you to events team, Cynthia in the background, She's the real MVP for making sure that we were all set up with all the technology. And just thank you for all the attendees who attended this afternoon. And we look forward to staying in touch and continuing the work to move the needle forward.
Thank you. Thank you, all presenters. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much for joining us.
And it's a pleasure. Thank you all so much for supporting us.
Yes, amazing. Impressive work. Amazing.
so
Can't wait.
much. And SQB integrates
Thanks,
links to
everyone.
digital access.